My name is Maria Maïlat. I am from Transylvania and arrived in France in 1986 during Ceausescu's dictatorship. I left Romania under difficult circumstances and was granted political asylum in France. I was a political refugee for a long time. I am a writer, first and foremost. But I don't think being a writer is a job, so I am also an anthropologist and work on the French society. I left Romania in 1986. It was very difficult at the time. Several other writers like me were banned from publishing their books. Censorship was extremely powerful and organized. I couldn't publish my work. I was under close surveillance. My phone was tapped. My belongings searched regularly. And they left proof that I was being watched, like letters in my mailbox that had been torn open. Once I received a book by a Suran from Paris, France. And I found only half of it in my mailbox. It had been cut lengthwise. So you can imagine the harsh conditions we were living in when I applied for a tourist visa. I wasn't the only one. We had been strongly encouraged to do so by the Securitate. In Romania, the best way to pressurize people was through starvation. We didn't have anything to eat. We had no medication because of the embargo against the country. Even the few products in the shops were in the hands of the Securitate, and thus controlled by the government. We were starving and cold because there was no heating. Electricity was only available 2 hours per day, so there was no hot water. We had to queue from 2 p.m. to get a bottle of milk or possibly a piece of meat or flour. Living conditions were extremely poor, and everybody suffered from hunger and disease. People were even weakened by the situation. That's why a lot of people became informants. And informing was a waste of time. It didn't change anything, but it did increase guilt and dependence on the system. From the moment someone gave information about their neighbor, a writer like me, for instance, they had to answer to the Securitate on one hand, and felt guilty towards their neighbor on the other hand, because they had watched them and told lies about them because they had nothing in particular other than I was listening to the radio or speaking with other writers. So it was informing for the sake of it, which kept people under regime's control. We called it communism, but I don't really know why. It would be interesting to, well, in my opinion, the people involved in the regime, in the dictatorship, were not communists. They were right-wing, left-wing, racist, former fascist, old and young, people with no political convictions, who didn't even think about politics, but who, in their everyday lives, were scared, hungry, or who hoped for a promotion because they wanted to have a successful career. That's why it's difficult to say that, at a political level, it was a communist regime, because people didn't necessarily have political convictions. People behaved in a certain way because of the negative climate of fear that the government encouraged. The only ones who tried to spur on debate, critical thinking, were either right-wing or left-wing values. It didn't matter, at least a political debate, were the intellectuals. And that's why they were hit first. Our articles were censored. We would be brought in, and the authorities would say, "What's behind this sentence? Its real meaning is a criticism of the system, and we don't like it." We faced strong pressure. Whole parts of books were deleted, and little by little, our articles. Some of us also wrote in newspapers, were banned, and we were ostracized. On the whole, it was done gradually. We were also requested to write certain kinds of poems, celebrating Ceausescu or praising the genius of the Carpathians. We were asked to do so because one of the elements of the system was a cult of personality. Many authors accepted saying, "I can save my skin and continue writing what I want at the same time." It was a way for them to retain some leeway for writing freely. Personally, I never did it, but I don't blame the ones who did. It was very difficult to understand why some managed to say no and others didn't. We knew people who were involved in censorship within the Securitate. They are still around today. They have become university lecturers, for instance. They are highly respected in Romania because fascist and communist authorities were never brought to justice, and I don't think they ever will. The way Ceausescu was eliminated prevented any kind of trial of the system. It was a travesty of justice. But in Romania, there was a second level of censorship that we were unfamiliar with. We knew some of the censors, but there were also people we referred to as the invisible ones at a second level. They were feared much more because we never knew when they would strike. Let me give you a personal example and talk about myself, although I could mention other writers as well. I published a book of short stories in Romania. The book was censored. Some short stories were removed. I was asked to change the end of one of them, in which one of the characters committed suicide, because I was told that the people didn't do that in our country. I agreed because I wanted to keep this short story, and the book was published. It was on the shelf for 3 months. I was invited to talk about it until one day, a critic wrote in the press an article stating that all the short stories were a criticism of the system. He wrote a long article saying that I was a traitor. This article was a sort of a trial for betrayal of communist values. The book was then removed from bookshops and libraries straight away. 15,000 copies had been printed. A few had been sold already, and from one day to the next they said, "Well, actually, we realized that." Every author feared this and suspected that their books would be banned. We had nightmares. And this gave rise to an even more perverse phenomenon. When people heard that a book was going to be withdrawn, they would rush to bookshops and buy it in secret. Booksellers had 48 hours to withdraw my book, and within that short time frame, almost all the copies were sold. The same happened in libraries. People would say, the book has disappeared. Someone didn't bring it back. We don't know where it is. In fact, books were being passed around covertly.